All right, hello everyone. I'm here with Atellus, and we're going to talk about the war in Ukraine. Uh, he is he's a man from Britain that has been fighting in Ukraine, so he is a combat veteran, and he's been fighting in Ukraine for some time now. If you don't mind me asking, what initially brought you over to Ukraine? Why are you there?
Well, I'd actually lived in Ukraine for a little while before. So that you get like a 90-day visa. So I would go and I would stay there for 89 days, live with some friends I have over there. And I actually had a holiday planned to go back to Ukraine for a little while when the war started. So it was just a matter of rearranging transport, really.
But you were basically kind of living over there before the war, so you were familiar with the area and
Yeah, I was living in a place called Poltava, which is very far in the east. It's not far from Kharkiv, and Kharkiv is obviously the first city to be attacked and fall. So I felt
Mhm.
like there's going to be the place I was living and planning on moving to is going to get steamrolled if I don't go there as quickly as possible. So
Isn't that where that's where Coach Red Pill was living? I don't know if you know that guy, Gonzalo Lira.
no, I've heard the name. I've heard the name, but
He was I'm embarrassed to say an American because I'm an American, but well, he was a Latino American, kind of loosely affiliated with the dissident right. But he like as soon as the Russians attacked Kharkiv, he started shilling for Russia. Like saying, "Oh, any minute they're going to take over the whole country,"
yeah.
and oh man, that guy just demolished his credibility. And supposedly he was captured by the Ukrainian secret police, and then it was just so weird. Um, but so you've been you're familiar with Ukraine, and it wasn't like you just heard about this war going on there and decided to just start fighting there. Like you actually had some I'm not gonna say roots, but you
A connection, yeah.
connections. Yeah, you were living there.
Yeah, and it was quite funny because I always told my friends who obviously they'd lived in the east of Ukraine, nobody expected this war was actually going to happen, and I kept telling them like, if war breaks out, I'm going over. Like,
Mhm.
don't be ridiculous. It's not going to be a war. Like everyone expected, kind of an escalation of proxy wars since been going on since 2014. Um, they expected, oh, the Russians are going to send, more equipment or this, that, and the other, and strengthen economical ties with the LPR and the DPR. But then they just full scale invaded, and nobody saw it coming.
Yeah, yeah. Well, there was like kind of a war going on, but it was just you can explain it to me because you're more familiar with Ukraine if you want. Just in the east, there was like a kind of civil war going on. Not a civil. Well, yeah, I guess it was a civil war,
Yeah, it
but
depends who you ask.
things get complicated indeed. There was a war going on, but it was kind of like if you weren't living in that immediate part of Ukraine, you could just live as you normally were, like nothing was happening, right?
Yeah, it was. Um, it kind of. I think Crimea being taken was the bigger deal. But
But
the
that was back in
fighting.
2014, you know.
Yeah, well, that's when the sort of war with the Luhansk and Donetsk People's Republic started as well, because the idea was to take all of that. And if you look at like where all the natural resources are in Ukraine, there's a lot of oil, steel, gas, that sort of stuff. It's in Crimea, it's in Donetsk and Luhansk. Um, so those regions are where they wanted to take, and it's still now where the Russians are saying we want these regions, because
Interesting.
that's where the money is basically.
So you're saying that this war is more about money than
No, I wouldn't say it's more about money, but you look throughout all human history, money and resources have always played a part in war.
are they trying to just deprive the Ukrainians, or is there something that Russians actually want for themselves in these areas? I know that they want like um, access to the water south
Yeah,
of Ukraine.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's because Russia is actually very, very, in terms of minerals, is very rich. It has a lot of oil, it has a lot of gas. It's got an unreal amount of natural resources. But what it doesn't want is a country on its border that's also very mineral rich. who can undercut it and has stronger ties with the West. Because it's not just like militarily that the Russians are going to be affected by having a Western aligned country on their border. They're going to be completely economically undermined as well. Because the Ukrainians, they did it with tanks. It was like they build these great tanks and then sell the designs to Westerners. And the Russians really didn't like that because a lot of them were based on old Russian tanks.
The Ukrainians were making tanks and selling them to the West.
Yeah, the Americans bought a load of them.
Really?
Yeah, there's.
I did not know that.
They're quite proud of it. It's ironically a lot of the tanks that the Russians are using to invade were made in Ukraine. It was like a big, because once the Soviet Union collapsed, there was loads of arguments over who these tank designs really belonged to. And I think it was in Kharkiv. I might be wrong, but there's a very iconic tank factory. And the only way to keep it economically viable was to sell tanks to the US, because the US wanted them for experiments and seeing what the Russian tanks were capable of. But this was like after the Cold War. This isn't recent.
But there's still a lot of animosity. I see. So there's resources in Ukraine, and there's I guess you could say political animosity, hostilities between these two countries over past grievances. Oh, you sold your tanks to the Americans, and this was our design. And
I wouldn't say that's necessarily like a motivating grievance that they have. I think it's just they see that as something that could potentially get worse. As Ukraine strengthens ties with the West, it's going to undermine Russia's economic position because they're going to be able to sell all these natural resources off. They're going to be able to have. I doubt American military bases will ever be put in Ukraine, but in theory, the Russians could be quite frightened of that. So that's their reasoning. The Russians don't need any more natural resources. They already have enough. It's more about like
competition.
Right? Yeah, we don't want the Ukrainians to be able to compete with us and strengthen the West.
So it sounds like to me you're kind of you're not excusing the Russians, but you kind of understand where they're coming from.
Yeah, I mean, to just the idea that they've just walked in and got tens of thousands, possibly over 100,000 soldiers killed for absolutely no reason whatsoever than we just want this land. This already vast country. Obviously, they've got their reasons. I disagree with them, but you don't have to agree with their reasoning to be able to see what it is. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, I'll admit I haven't done a lot of research as far as like motivations go. All of the politics surrounding this war. I mean, some of it is just an enigma to a Westerner that's not there. Like there's only so much I can understand because the Western media basically frames it like Russia's just invading Ukraine because they're mean.
Yeah, it's like the damage that Star Wars has done to the political landscape of
all the journalists. Yeah,
it's like they're the evil empire and they're invading because they're evil and bad. It's like I don't like them for obvious reasons, but to imply that they're just invading because they just felt like it is, you have to have something to gain out of this.
Yeah, my first assumption was what you said about Ukraine joining NATO or U.S. military bases like popping up in Ukraine, and there is a Russian population in eastern Ukraine that was involved in the fighting before this war broke out. So that's kind of what I was thinking about. But there's definitely it sounds like there's definitely a lot more to it.
Yeah, I mean it's like any war. It's all nuanced, and this idea that we've only just recently started fighting for natural resources is kind of stupid. Because, for example, the Romans invaded Britain because of the tin reserves. They needed tin because tin helps you make bronze, and bronze helps you make all sorts of stuff. And that's been a big driving force behind the wars in the Bronze Age was over tin mines. It's like we've always been fighting over natural resources and deposits of metal and oil and everything like that. It's not a recent thing. So whenever I bring up that fact, it is like this question of, oh, so the war is all about, you know, oil and finances. It's like, yeah, because you need money to pay soldiers. You can't have a war without money. It's of course finances are going to be, you know, they're going to be factoring into how you fight the war.
Absolutely. So let's see, how do we segue into this? So when did you heard about the war, and did you just go over there immediately? Were you in Britain at the time, or like how did you find yourself coming into this war? Did you just sign a contract and fly to Ukraine, or were you already there?
I would have killed for a contract. No, it was
Oh man.
it was just we turned up, and the way that the media was going on about things, you would have thought you were stepping off the train in Kiev, and then here's your gun, off you go. That seemed to be how it was being portrayed, which it wasn't like that at all. But I arrived within a few days of the war starting, within the first week, and there was a lot of foreign volunteers at that point who just turned up and they were like, we're here to help. A lot of them more useful than others. Some guys were there for the Instagram fame. That was a big problem. But I would say the majority of guys were there for the right reasons. There was a lot of Americans who just heard that another country's freedom is being threatened by their old Cold War enemy, and it was like that was enough for them. They didn't really, they wouldn't have been able to point to Ukraine on a map before then. They were just like, I'm here because the idea of freedom is being threatened for somebody. It's like, I kind of respect that in a lot of ways. But no, I sort of turned up. I was initially trying to join Azov, but because they were the first guys who were like, we want foreigners to come and help. But then the Ukrainian government immediately put a stop to that because that's what happened in 2014. And obviously Azov became very influential in politics and the military. And they didn't want a repeat of that. And then they made us all go to the International Legion. And the International Legion, as far as I was concerned, and I'm still suspicious of it now, I'm not sure it really exists. I think it's a bureaucratic thing. I think they're the legal organization that you sign your contract with. They're like a legal entity, but they're not actually a military unit. That seems to be my impression. I don't know if I'm allowed to say that or not, but that seems to be because we thought we were part of the International Legion, the first group that I was in. And then it turns out the actual International Legion had never heard of us. It was just a bunch of military guys who were just, and politicians who were just starting up almost their own thing, completely independently. We had no idea. They never told us. And so I ended up in a unit called Kapowska Siege. And they're still going. They've still got a lot of foreigners there. That's basically where a lot of the foreigners who just wanted to get to the front as soon as possible ended up. They didn't give you a contract. They didn't make you do all these weeks of sitting around doing paperwork, and they weren't bothered about getting, you need to have a weapon permit and you need to have licenses to be able to carry it, blah, blah. Kapowska Siege was just like, here's your AK. We're going to the front next week. And it was quick and it was efficient, and that's sort of why a lot of us went to that.
How would they know? Because they like in the media, they made a big deal. It's, like if you're going to go there, you got to have some kind of military experience or background, So you probably had like just a glut of people showing up, probably a lot of people even lying about it.
Oh yeah, absolutely. We had one guy who was claiming he'd been a machine gunner and a marksman
Oh my
in
god.
Afghanistan. And when he got asked about which unit he was in, he gave off some unit that had been, I can't remember the details exactly, but he gave a unit that had been disbanded in the 90s. And he was just, we called them Walter Mitties. It's like they close their eyes and imagine that they're a soldier, and all of a sudden they become one. And we had a lot of guys like that that were just obviously lying.
But they still got a gun and sent to the front, right?
Some of them.
Some of them did.
But usually the people around them would pick up on it quite quickly and just say, I'm not going to the front with this guy.
But they would go to the front. Would they go to the front with someone else, or would they get kicked out of the country? Or
they wouldn't usually get kicked out of the country because the Ukrainians didn't really care that this guy didn't have the experience he was claiming to have, because it doesn't take a lot of experience to sit in a trench. But it was like, do we really want this guy with no experience on the team at the expense of this guy who's like ex special forces or whatever? They're obviously going to curtail more to the guys with more experience going, we don't want this guy anywhere near us.
Right. They still, you were saying that they would still put these guys in a trench that had no military experience.
Yeah, but a lot of the guys with no military experience were just honest about it.
What about the ones that were honest? What did they do with those guys?
We had a few guys in my unit in Capacity Siege, and we trained them up a little bit. So we had like a month or a month and a half, and we would just give them like crash courses in basic stuff.
I mean, if they're honest about not having experience, I mean, that's at least a lot more. I mean, you can respect that versus somebody that's like making up shit.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Because it's when you're lying about having experience that you don't have, people are going to trust you to do things you can't do, and you're going to get
a huge liability.
Yeah, whereas someone who doesn't have any military experience, you're not going to expect, them to be Rambo and take on a machine gun on their own. Do you know what I mean?
They're going to think they're Rambo.
Well, no, it's funny because a lot of the guys with no military experience actually did quite well. A lot of the guys who got shaken up the most were people who'd been in Iraq and been in Afghanistan, because they'd never been on the receiving end of airstrikes and the receiving end of artillery. And they just didn't get why they couldn't call in an airstrike, why they couldn't call in.
That is interesting.
Whereas the guys with no experience whatsoever, they just didn't know any better.
They could adapt. They could adapt to the situation better than the old veterans that were like used to things being a certain way and it had to be that way. That's interesting. That is very interesting.
Yeah, because a lot of guys were just, they get very easily frustrated. I got frustrated, not with, because I understood the Ukrainian army, because obviously I'd lived in Ukraine for a little while, and I had been considering doing, because they had a thing where you could do military service to get residency and citizenship and stuff. I'd been looking into that. But I wasn't expecting artillery support and air support doing everything, because I'd never deployed when I was in the British Army. So I hadn't been in a situation where I'd had to rely on that. But I understood how Ukraine works and how the Ukrainian army was going to work. Whereas a lot of the guys who had been, they had been the guys calling in the artillery. And I remember we were sat in this position. There's an American guy, and he just goes, after all this time, I finally found out how it feels to be the Taliban. And it fucking sucks.
That is wow.
What was interesting was that a lot of the American soldiers started to have more respect for the guys that they'd been fighting. They started to look back at it and wow, this is fucking terrifying. How were they doing this all the time? And I thought that was interesting, that it's reframed their whole perspective on the war, that they had more respect for their previous enemies, having been in the situations they were in.
It's definitely the case that a lot of these military veterans are as far as war goes, they might be set in their ways. If I guess to make a really bad analogy, but fitting, is like somebody that starts their own business versus somebody that gets a degree in business. And they're like, oh, they have it in their mind because they went to business school. You've got to do this and it's got to be like this. But the person that's actually been, running their own business out on the street, they were able to adapt because their expectations were lower or non-existent.
Yeah, yeah. I that makes sense as an analogy, because it was like the guys who were working on a clean slate, they could adjust to that environment. Whereas the guys who expected it to be something different, they didn't like conceive of warfare outside of what they had experienced, which is natural. I think I'm not trying to like talk down on them or anything, but if you've spent years doing war and it's always been a certain way, you kind of expect war to be the same way when you go somewhere else. But it was very different.
It's like hiring boomers to work at an electronics store. No, I'm just kidding. You so I guess the moral of the story is, if there's a war going on, don't turn away guys that don't have experience, as long as they're honest about it.
Yeah, I mean, I would have liked to have had more time with them to train them up and get them a bit more conditioned. But it's very much a sink or swim kind of thing. We're also talking about artillery. You can't train somebody to be under artillery fire. It's like the building you're in is rattling. The windows are breaking. If it gets really, really close, it's like you can't train somebody for that. You either break or you don't.
And the veterans didn't even have experience with this, is what you're telling me, Alana.
Yeah, I remember
they were not on the receiving end. Yeah.
No, the first time I got shelled, I remember it very vividly, as I'm sure you can imagine. We were sat in this house, and they must have rained on us for maybe 5 minutes solid. It feels a lot longer, but it was our position was being fired on, and our team leader was a guy who'd done 12 years in Iraq and Afghanistan, not 12 years in the army, but like 12 years worth of deployments. He was a real veteran.
Wow.
And the first time I ever got shelled, he's a team leader. After it was finished, he says, "Whoa, that was the biggest barrage I've ever been in." And it's like that's the first barrage I've ever been in. But yeah, it was like I've skipped the tutorial and started the game on hard mode. was the joke. But no, it was you hear them coming in, it's just. But the irony is, by the time you're hearing that whistle, it's probably already not going to hit you. You're never going to hear the one that hits you because it's traveling so fast.
Is that right?
Yeah, but you're not thinking about that when you're actually getting shelled. There's nothing in the world that could make you like sit there and think, well, actually, if you consider the speed that it's traveling at and the direction that it's going, like that's you're not having that thought.
Right. How close has it come to you? Like, how have there been any close ones that have like hit nearby or hit your building?
Yeah, I remember hearing the dirt from the impact falling behind me, like a few meters away.
And it's incredibly loud, right? Like, what
it's
like?
Impossibly loud.
So you probably
you hear a lot of jokes about. I've made them myself, but it's jokes about like veterans and fireworks. I guess if you're not actually like if you've not been in combat, it's kind of distasteful to make jokes about veterans and fireworks. But I remember as I was saying, the first time I got shelled, team leader, he asks me, "So what did you think?" He's just like trying to get everybody's heads together and trying to make sure that everybody's still thinking straight. And I said, I think I've ruined next year's family fireworks display.
Yeah, wow.
But it wasn't that, because we do have yearly fireworks in Britain on the 5th of November. And I was back home for that, and that didn't do anything to me at all, the hearing fireworks. What got me was thunder.
Thunder was freaking you out?
hearing close thunder. It wasn't freaking me out, but there's something in my monkey brain instinct that hears a loud boom and the windows like quaking a little bit that makes me go, oh, we're being fired on. Even if I know that we're not, obviously, because I'm in England. And something very wrong would have had to have happened for that, for that to start. But it is close. I've discussed this with a few guys. It is closer to a force of nature. Fireworks aren't like anything even close to being under artillery fire. It is like you're thinking earthquakes, thunder, that sort of thing. Some force of nature that you can't contend with. That's closer to being under artillery fire than like fireworks.
And I imagine it's absolutely terrifying.
You don't have time to be scared. I wouldn't have ever said that I was scared. I felt like a wild animal. Because I had to run I had to run, and me being the genius that I am, I left my helmet behind.
Oh,
I had to run through artillery fire to deliver a message to our guys in another position. And that was intense, but I wasn't thinking about it as I did it. I did it, I got back, the shelling stopped, and I just thought like, I actually just did that.
So you're just your adrenaline's pumping, you're just in the moment, and you can't you don't have, it's just not in you to feel any fear or potentially even any pain.
Yeah, I mean, fear was for the way there. Fear is like when you're, because I remember I took a week out after my first rotation. I got back. The guy that I was, one of the guys I was with, he was absolutely mad. He was doing his PhD in the middle of it all. So whenever we weren't being fired on, we had we just could just sit around. He'd pull out his laptop and start working on his PhD.
What the? Wait, what?
Yeah, he was absolutely insane.
A PhD, was this guy was Ukrainian or American?
No, he was German.
A German, okay.
Yeah, and he was everything. He was the most stereotypical German you could imagine. Like everything had to be efficient. Everything had to be done. It's like everyone else is resting, and he's there, and he'll get his laptop out, and he'll just start working on his PhD in law. It's like, what are you doing?
That's okay. That guy's different.
Oh yeah, for sure. But he was going to back home for a little while. He was studying in he was German, but he was in Austria. He was studying in Vienna. It's like, oh yeah, I'm going back to Vienna for a week. Do you want to come with me? And this was when we were on leave. We've just come back from the front, and I was like, yeah, sure, I'll come with. Because I felt I'd earned a little break and a few drinks at that point.
Indeed.
And yeah, it was almost surreal being back in the civilized world. It was, I remember laughing like a maniac for some reason in a McDonald's, because I didn't know where else I could get something to eat. So I went to a McDonald's in Vienna, and I just started laughing hysterically. Like 3 days ago, I was in a war zone. Then I sat in a car, and now no one around me has any idea, like the situation that I was just in. But coming back from Vienna, that was when I started to like wake up thinking I'd been shelled. Like in the middle of the night when I was in Vienna and getting ready to come back, that was when the fear started mounting. It was like, I've just come out of that place. There's part of the human mind that just goes, why are you going back? Like, for what reason? And it's like an instinctual thing. And of course I went back and did another rotation, but it was like, that was the most afraid I've ever been, I think.
Just you felt fear just returning. That's interesting. Yeah. But you wanted to go back. You
of course
wanted to go back.
Yeah, of course. But only the first time, because I have come away and gone back a few times since. But the first time I wanted to return, that was the most afraid I've been. Since then, it's not the same. But there is just like, you have to get over this voice in the back of your head telling you, you just gotten out of there. Why are you going back there?
And you've just been so close to death, just like so many times, running through artillery barrages, and I'm certain you've been on the receiving end of gunfire. And
Actually, no, I've not been on the receiving end of gunfire. A lot of artillery, a lot of tanks. Tanks are absolutely terrifying, but not rifle fire. And
really,
yeah, because they never made an infantry push. Everything was always level the place with artillery, sending BMPs, sending
well, just
tanks.
to be clear, they did infantry pushes in other parts of Ukraine, but in the part you're in, they did.
Yes, in Izium, where I was, they weren't doing that. At least while I was there, and there were rumors. I can't substantiate this, but I heard this from my other guys who were there. They were saying the reason that they never made an infantry push was because these were conscripts, and the conscripts had heard that there were foreigners occupying the forward positions, and they refused to engage.
Why?
Because ironically, the Russian propaganda had completely worked against them. They thought that we were all like terrifying super soldier Nazi special forces mercenaries who were going to execute every last one of them. It's like, and they were just their own propaganda about how evil and horrible we were had actually like scared them.
That's ironic. That's
Yeah. And
wow.
at least that's the theory. I can't confirm any of that, and obviously I've not spoken to any of the Russians on the other side who didn't
Now,
want to come make a push. But
I'm wondering, have you actually seen any Russians or Russian soldiers? I mean, you certainly you fired your rifle, but you haven't been on the receiving end of any fire. So I'm wondering, have you seen the Russians out there in the field and shot at them, or seen them running around, or anything like that?
no, it's been vehicles. It's been all mechanized stuff. I never saw like an individual Russian soldier moving here or there. It's kind of disheartening. And I've heard that a lot from a lot of Ukrainians and foreigners alike. It's like it's kind of depressing when you're seeing all these guys have gotten injured. But yeah, like on the Ukrainian side, it's like it gets a bit disheartening that they've suffered these injuries and they've never even saw a Russian infantry soldier, because everyone still has this in the back of their mind. Everybody, even experienced and combat veterans, that war is like man against man.
Yeah, it doesn't feel like a proper war.
Yeah, it's like it's your job to sit here in this ditch and it's getting leveled by artillery and tanks just in case the enemy decides to make an infantry push after they've already done all of this stuff.
Well, like you've seen APCs, right? Armored personnel carriers, and
yeah, but the BMPs, the Russians go. There's the BMP and there's the other one. It's B something.
So they're not really using them to dismount. They're just sort of using them as like light, not tanks, but like light attack vehicles or whatever.
Yeah, they call them battle taxis.
Okay,
but
battle taxis. Okay.
Yeah, but the Russian doctrine is, I only really studied it in depth after I'd already been on the front and got confused as to why they were doing what they were doing, because every day they would send like 6 BMPs and then we'd destroy 3 of them and the other 3 would turn around and go back to where they come from, and then the next day 6 more BMPs would come down the road. It's like, why didn't you just send 9 yesterday? And that to me was kind of strange. But looking into Russian doctrine, the idea is that they'll rush forward and they'll try to exploit a gap or a weakness. That's their whole doctrine. So they'll send 6 vehicles forward in the hopes that some of them will get through, and then they'll send some reinforcements. All they're doing is probing for weakness. So they would just send vehicle after vehicle after vehicle that would just get destroyed. And the next day they would just keep coming, just looking for a gap in the lines.
I see. So they're using the vehicles as just to feel things out, feel out where there's any gaps. I'm just kind of paraphrasing here. And when you just did you destroy any vehicles yourself? I'm certain you've used an anti-tank weapon.
No, that was actually the reason that I left Kopaska Siege,
Hmm.
was that they were sending us out into these trenches against tanks, and they refused to give us any anti-tank weapons. Like
Oh
my
my god.
whole unit, all the foreigners, all the English speaking foreign units, they were refusing to give us anti-tank weapons. And when I started, I started kicking off a bit because I was in charge of my group. I was like, it's like they accused me of being like, what was it? They said it was, these were all guys who had no military experience whatsoever. This is like, you are refusing to do your duty and you'll be labeled a traitor. And I was like, refusing to do my fucking duty? I'm asking for the weapon that lets me do this. It would be like me saying, okay, I want to shoot that guy. Someone give me a rifle. And it's like, oh, you're refusing to shoot him. I was like, I'm not refusing to shoot him. I'm asking for the tools that I need to engage him. And the thing was, it wasn't like they were scarce, because that morning I had helped unload like 50 of them out of a big truck. So I knew we had them. I just wanted one guy in my whole unit to have an anti-tank weapon, and he
Just
refused
one
to
in
hand
your
it
whole
over.
unit. Wow. Wow. And your unit was made up of foreign fighters again, just to
Yeah, yeah.
and they just they're not giving any anti-tank weapons to any or most
Uh,
foreigners, as far as you can tell.
I think that was a unique thing for where I was. I don't think that's the case even in most of Kobaska Siege. I don't think that was the majority of the case. I think it was just because this was right when the war started. Um, they'd only just been made like an official military unit, and so a bunch of guys who didn't have a clue what they were doing were being handed like officer ranks, and they were a little bit spiteful because we'd done such a good job on the first rotation. They started being like, oh, we can't have these guys doing a better job than us because it makes us look bad.
Yeah, it's like office politics, but
It
in
was,
war.
it was, yeah,
Jesus.
it was office politics, but people's lives are on the line. So that's why I ended up leaving, and yeah, that's quite a few people followed suit.
Leaving the unit, you mean, or
Yeah, leaving that unit. Yeah,
yeah.
they either found other units, or they went home, or they got injured, or they got killed. I think there's one guy left who I know who's still in that unit.
So it sounds like on the Ukrainian side, see, from the standpoint of being like a Westerner, just kind of being exposed to Western media on the situation in Ukraine, you get this impression that it's the Russian side that's uniquely incompetent, but that's not really the case, is it?
Um, well, no, because a lot of the Ukrainian higher ups have been trained by the Russians, and a lot of them have a Soviet mindset, and a lot of the younger guys are very encouragingly they hate that, and they
The younger Ukrainian officers and soldiers.
yes,
Okay.
yeah, a lot of them want to be more like a NATO army, not in the sense that it's because me and my friend from Vienna, we were always joking. It's like, why is being NATO standard some kind of bragging point? Like NATO is just it's just an organization. It's like, why
We
is
just sort of take it for granted. Like, of course, you would have a competent military where units at least have some kind of training and the weapons that they need to
yeah,
engage the enemy, and they kind of know how to use them, right?
yeah, exactly. And then you see that some of these like volunteer units, and it's like, oh, that's why some people brag about being NATO standard. It's like, oh, he knows how to zero his rifle. Wow.
That's something I wanted to get to, is that I mean, you told me, or before we did this recorded discussion, we've been talking about this for some time, that even a lot of the Ukrainian soldiers don't bother to zero their rifles or don't know how, and these are supposed to be like professional soldiers, right?
Yeah, but I mean, equally, a lot of this stuff is being applied to 50, 60-year-old AKs. It's like, You're not going to hit much with it anyway. And
So it's
even
like so
then,
crappy that it's like, why even bother? And then that sort of reinforces this idea that you don't need to zero your rifle. That's, Western BS, right?
yeah, I mean, a lot of things have changed since the start of the war. A lot of things have changed. Very recently, it's been a lot more encouraging seeing the guys who do know what they're doing and can lead their squad. But when the war first started, it was like, here's a shitty old AK, and I was saying like, I remember being given mine, and the front sights, the front sight post was so far to the right, it was insane. And my rifle had the nickname Ever Brawn because she was all the way to the far right. that was the joke. But the front sight post was like almost touching the side, and it was impossible to hit anything. And I was like, "What am I supposed to do with this?"
Well, you didn't have a chance to zero. You
No,
couldn't
I
you
didn't.
couldn't fix that.
When I was saying like I need to zero this rifle, people were like rolling their eyes at me. So when you look at it,
Oh
and
my goodness.
oh, it was funny because I survived, but if I hadn't, it wouldn't have been. Do you know what I mean? It's a lot of things like that.
Yeah, I couldn't imagine. I mean, it's hard enough to hit something with a rifle when it is zeroed, moving targets. But if it's not even zeroed, I mean, the best you can do is spray and pray.
Yeah,
Yeah. You
but
know,
I mean, there was quite a funny one when we were teaching the guys how to shoot, or just going through a range and showing the guys just like firearm basics and stuff that they missed. A lot of them were, competent enough, but the guys who weren't, it certainly helped them.
so wait, it was a mix. So you were teaching firearms competency to a mixed group of guys.
No, not well. This last rotation, it was training in Donetsk. So we were right behind the front line. We were like, our range had been getting lit up since 2014. So so it wasn't like a secret that we were there. But we were sort of helping the guys with some stuff. Most of them were really good. A lot of them were very, very good. But
And what kind of guys were you were training, just like guys that were new to war and veterans, or like what kind of were they all foreigners, or were some of them Ukrainian?
These guys were all Ukrainians. They were an actual army unit.
They were actual army. Okay.
Yeah, they were all combat veterans, but a lot of the time they had never gotten into an infantry engagement, for example.
Okay.
Like so they've been shelled, and they had this kind of bravado about everything. But
They had their veteran card, but they had never actually been in like an infantry fight.
Yeah, but the thing is, and as I say, I've not been in a firefight either.
But you know how to use a rifle.
Yeah, of course, yes. But it's like, from what I've heard about the guys who've been in firefights in Afghanistan and then been to Ukraine and been lit up by artillery, they always say the firefights are way easier, way more fun. It's like the artillery part is the hard part.
Mm-hmm.
But no, it was like some of them were. We had this one little guy, and everything he was shooting, he was missing. He was just missing every shot, and I was like, "Is your rifle zeroed?" Oh no, it's not zeroed. It's not zeroed at all. That's the problem. And then I picked up the rifle, fired it 4 times on target 4 times. I gave it to like one of my guys who was just a civilian. He just sort of come along to help. He fires it 4 times, hits 4 times. It's like,
so it was zeroed.
Like, it was actually zeroed. Yeah, it was just terrible. But that became like almost an excuse for the guys who were really quite shit. They just blame it on the rifles not being zeroed, which wasn't true.
I forgot to mention to people that are listening that zeroing your rifles basically when you align your sights. So point of aim is point of impact. And the thing about like firearms is that you you kind of have 2 camps of people, where on 2 extremes, and then you have like a middle, right? Like let me explain. Like, um, you have one camp that thinks that you have to have military experience to understand and use a rifle, and then you have other people that think, uh, if the shit hits the fan, they can just raid an armory or pick one up and they'll know what to do, and that's also BS. And the reality is that you do need to have some kind of training to use a rifle. And the training doesn't have to be military experience. You could watch, like, if you're just into learning stuff, you could just watch a YouTube video and figure it out. It's not rocket science, how to adjust sights, and maybe get some experience behind a rifle. As a civilian shooter here in America, I mean, I've zeroed all of my rifles. I have no military experience, and I just go to the range, I shoot. But it sounds like these people just didn't bother to do any sort of research even while they were in the military. Some of these
Yeah,
people. Yeah.
yeah. I mean, it's like you say, it's people who have experience with firearms know what zeroing a rifle is. But if you've never understood you've never picked up a rifle, you never picked up a firearm, you would of course assume that what you're looking at down the sights is where the bullet's going to go. You don't realize that you have to make adjustments. And I think that kind of attitude has prevailed. It's this almost like, of course, the gun's going to hit what I'm going to shoot at. And having quite infamously inaccurate firearms hasn't helped with that. It's because you don't know whether your rifle's zeroed or not, because even if it is, you're still not going to hit anything.
So that just reinforces the idea that it doesn't even matter to these people, kind of like the Soviet mindset.
Yeah, but one with the 545 millimeter AKs are, I like them. I really like them. I really
They're better
like
than
how.
the 7.62, right?
Yeah, there's not as much kickback to them. They're much easier to control. They're much more accurate. They're good. They're good fun. And I'm used to a much smaller rifle. That's the only difference, because I'm used to the bullpups. But they're reliable. They're easy to clean. You end up picking up some old terrible habits of just not cleaning the rifles. I know one guy whose rifle was still firing. He'd use it like daily. He's like, I haven't cleaned this in 9 months.
Wow.
It's like it's still just firing. It's pretty good. And then I know Americans who would like over clean their rifles, and then they would just jam constantly. It's
Yeah.
really strange.
You don't want to, yeah, I guess you don't want to over clean. They're probably used to, well, I don't even think Armalite rifles, AR variants like the M16, the M4, AR-15. I think people do over clean them. And that's because in something that happened back in like Vietnam, they used the wrong type of like gunpowder that was jamming the rifles. And ever since, everybody is like in this mindset that they need to clean the hell out of the rifles when they don't. But yeah, I just want to touch upon this real quick. There's a lot of people out there in the world, in the West, that they think about like shit hitting the fan, and if it does, they'll just pick up a gun and it'll be just like the video games where the sniper scope will automatically be zeroed or something,
Yeah.
or that they don't need to clean a gun, or
Yeah.
like,
or know how to breathe when they're firing and stuff like that.
Or I mean, even like people have to understand that it's not like the video games. It's not like a laser coming out. You have to understand that there's bullet drop, and you have to understand like all of these intricate details with a firearm, like how to clear a jam, how to load the magazines, how to put the magazine in the gun. There's so many different ways to clear a jam, or like why is the front and back sight posts are 2 inches above the barrel, because it's not like a handgun. There's so much to learn, and it's not like the video games. It's not like Call of Duty or Counter-Strike. And I encourage anyone listening to learn as much as they can about firearms. It's just an important thing to know. Okay, so what were we let's pick up where we left off. So there is there's a lack of training, or I guess you have people coming to the front that have just like video game knowledge of firearms, perhaps, but that's it.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there's the biggest thing was flagging. I'm sure you've seen like a million videos of
Oh
people flagging each
yeah,
other. It's
yeah.
like even if you've just played a video game, you know not to point your rifle like at your own teammates. It's just, you know what I mean? It's
Uh, this is why having a firearms culture is important, because if you don't, you're going to have people in your military, especially if you have to conscript them immediately if there's like an invasion going on, because in the civilian side, it's just drilled into our heads like, hey, you don't flag the other person with your rifle or handgun or whatever. That's just a huge no.
yeah. I mean, it's it's not even it's common sense. You- it's like don't point it at anybody if you're not intending to shoot them. But then you also have things on the other side. I've seen a video recently of a guy who like dives to the ground because he's getting shot at and they're getting lit
Right.
up. I can't remember if it was artillery or small arms. And he lands on the ground and his rifle is pointing at his friend. And everyone's like, "Whoa, that's a firearm safety violation." It's like, yeah, from a bunch of people who've never been shot at and never had to get down as quickly as humanly possible. It's like, oh, I'm being shot at. I better adjust my rifle here so that it's not pointing anywhere. It's no, it's like sometimes you just have to get the down.
That's true. That's true. I can definitely understand that. I mean, you don't have time to think about it, but it just like they were just casually talking to each other. I couldn't be, I wouldn't be that relaxed if a rifle were pointing at me. They seemed
Yeah,
pretty relaxed
yeah,
in the
but
middle of
that's
a
the thing
war
because
zone.
it's kind of normal. Like you get used to it after a while, unfortunately. And there's always jokes about if any of us are going to go back and rejoin the armies of our home country, we're not going to fit in. We're going to be like the worst in terms of firearm safety violations and stuff. It's just like we've picked up so many bad habits. Um, no, I'm exaggerating, obviously, but it is like you don't clean your weapon as often as you do in you're like a NATO army. You're not as careful with flagging and stuff like that, unfortunately. I've been flagged with a fucking Panzerfaust.
Wow.
That's the most interesting thing I've been flagged by. It's like, point that away from me, please. That's a rocket launcher.
You can check that off the bucket list.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I
So
don't know if you must have seen the video of me firing those two machine guns.
I did not. I did
Did you
not. Would
not?
you can actually pull it up here if you want and show it. Up to you. Or
I
I could insert it in later if you want me to show that.
yeah, I guess. I'll send it to you on Telegram. But yeah, there's a video of me firing two RPK machine guns on full auto.
Cool.
I would never ever be able to do that in the British Army, not for one single second. It's like the idea of picking up two machine guns and firing them on full auto is just like the most dangerous thing you could imagine. We were doing it on the shooting range because we thought it'd be funny.
How is it
And
dangerous?
because it's like pushing you back. I'm not a small guy by any means, but I'm like getting pushed back. One of our guys got
Oh, okay.
when
Yeah,
he
these are
when he tried it, he wasn't expecting the recoil, and it just rained shell casings on somebody else.
okay, so it is like a heavy machine gun, right? The RPK?
It's
Or is it like
no, no, no. It's somewhere between. It's basically a really big AK.
Hmm.
It's more like a
Would it be
squad automatic
classified?
weapon.
Okay.
It's like the Russians and the Soviets had this stupid design manifesto where it's like, oh, the Americans have a marksman rifle. What should we do? We make long AK. They have submachine guns. We make small AK. The shotguns, combat shotgun AK, and the RPK is like a light machine gun AK, basically. Every single thing that NATO or the Americans designed in terms of weaponry, the Russians took and made an AK version of it.
Hmm.
and a lot of them are shit.
They have a lot of AKs. So is this kind of segues into the Soviet mindset with regard to war and their military doctrine and kind of some of the things we discussed earlier. Do you want to expand on that, or have we covered that already?
We've got it a little bit, but a lot of the Soviet mindset is this lack of care about casualties, which is mainly a Russian thing. The Russians are still in this mindset of casualties aren't relevant to whether or not the mission was successful. It's Hostomel Airport's a good example. I think they spoke. There's some commentators on YouTube. They were talking about this. I think it was Willie, the Australian guy with the brain tumor. He was talking about it, and Hostomel Airport's a perfect example of that because the Russians took like an absurd number of casualties, and I have friends who were there at Hostomel Airport, and they said that they just kept coming. It was like it didn't matter how many of them you gunned down; they just landed more paratroopers, and they just kept coming.
Where was this airport again?
Hostomel, it's in Kiev. It was right at the start of the war.
Okay,
like the opening days.
That's where they had the big infantry push.
No, it wasn't the infantry push. They just dropped a lot of paratroopers.
Oh, yeah, that's what I meant. Boots on the ground. That's what I meant.
Yeah, but they did like anyone who's studied anything in terms of military history knows that an unsupported paratroop landing is just a massacre. When the Germans did it in Crete, it was the exact same thing. They had an unsupported paratroop landing, and it was just a massacre. And the Russians did the exact same thing in Hostomel. They just kept landing paratroopers into machine gun positions without any kind of support. And we regard that as a terrible, horrible failure because all of their paratroopers died. But they regard it as a success because the airport was no longer operable.
So they just whatever they want to accomplish, they just throw bodies at it. They throw
pretty
bodies
much, yeah,
and it doesn't matter.
And there's stories of the Germans in World War II of Russians sending like 1,000, taking like 1,000 casualties and just leveling somewhere with artillery, just to wound like 3 Germans as they're retreating, and like force them out of the position. And to the Russians, it doesn't matter how they don't take casualties into consideration when regarding failure or success. To them, if the objective is achieved, it's a success. It doesn't matter how many bodies you have to throw into the meat grinder for that to happen.
Wow, I just, it's just bizarre to me that that I mean, I guess I don't know how well the Russian population takes that or the other.
That's why they're using Wagner, and they're recruiting out of prisons. It's like it's a lot easier for the Kremlin to say to the Russian people, "Oh, all those people have just been massacred. They're actually mercenaries, or they're actually prisoners. So they're not really Russian citizens." Whereas the Russian army is doing perfectly well. Do you get what I mean?
But that's not the truth, is it?
No, but when have the Russians ever cared about the truth?
And it's I mean, Russia is the most populous country in Europe, but its population is declining, right?
Yeah,
and they're sending these people.
The women already outnumbered the men, like 3-1 or something ridiculous.
And now it's going to be like 10-1 or something.
Yeah,
it keeps up.
And it's kind of funny that I saw another discussion between I can't remember if he was like a Russian citizen who'd left the West or something like that, or he defected. I can't remember what exactly it was. But he was saying that when we in the West and NATO and everything like that calculate casualties, casualty just means somebody who has been incapacitated and can no longer fight in that battle. It doesn't necessarily mean he's been killed. So if you take 1,000 casualties, they reckon it's like, I can't remember the exact statistics, but we'll say for the sake of argument, it's like 1/3 of those are killed, and the other 2/3 are people who've been injured. And that there are like examples in the past of armies taking more casualties than they had men because people have been wounded more than once. Whereas in the Russian army, they're saying there's this Russian guy who is saying, no, that's not the figure for Russians, because if somebody gets wounded, they just leave them. All casualties are basically just deaths. And the Russians themselves have posted pictures of Ukrainian medical, what's called an IFAK, individual first aid kit, Ukrainian IFAKs and Russian IFAKs. And the Russians themselves are posting this saying, like, look at how much better their IFAKs are than ours.
And for those that don't know, an IFAK is basically like a personal first aid kit. You see the soldiers carrying on their on themselves, usually on their belts or their backpacks.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it has like,
And
you have a tourniquet in there and band-aids and all kinds of stuff like that.
yeah, and the tourniquets are usually kept like in pouches separately on your carrier or on your belt. But I've seen videos of Russians have been killed, and the Ukrainians are going through, like, the Ukrainians are looking into their plate carrier, and there's a guy cable tied his tourniquet to his plate carrier. A Russian soldier, he'd cable tied it to his plate carrier, so he couldn't get the tourniquet off his carrier.
Hmm.
And their tourniquets a lot of the time are like these red leather belts, and it's still the old kind of tourniquet where if you use it, you're going to lose a limb.
Whoa! So there's tourniquets that you don't want to use that are actually dangerous.
Yeah, I mean, during I think it was the Gulf War, when tourniquets started to become like mandatory in use, the biggest thing that killed like NATO soldiers was the refusal to use a tourniquet because they thought they were going to lose a limb if they used one, so they just bled out. And that's that was a big thing because that's what tourniquets used to do. They don't anymore, but now, like, the Russians are still using the ones that actually will take your limb off. I don't know how much they're using them because, as I say, things have changed a lot since the start of the war on both sides. But at least for a time, they were using these tourniquets where if you got hit in the arm and you were like grazed, you started use of your arm, but you were bleeding quite heavily, and you put a tourniquet to stop the bleeding, then you would lose the arm. And that's a really difficult decision to make.
Indeed, and I'm sure that increases their casualty rate, and if it's deaths in their case. So again, you've been out in the field, and you're talking to people. Have you seen any Russians at all? Like, I know you said you haven't seen any like boots on the ground soldiers running around, but you've surely come across like a dead Russian or something, right? Or just your people in other units that you talk to.
Oh yeah, of course. And there were Russians getting captured and stuff like that, but they weren't people. They weren't my guys doing it. And generally, when a BMP gets hit, there's not really anything you can pull out of there that looks like a human.
But you've seen blown up BMPs, right? Like you've seen,
blown up BMPs and that sort of thing. But that's
have you seen like, I'm really picking your brain here. Have you seen like, I'm sure you've seen some disgusting stuff like a leg on the ground or something next to a BMP.
The worst thing that I've seen, weirdly enough, the thing that I remember the most was a dog. It was a Caucasian Shepherd. It was a lovely, very well behaved dog. And it turned around and its like ribs have been eaten by phosphorus.
Oh,
and there's something different between seeing like people who you know are kind of we're here to fight. We all understand what we're doing here, but like a very good, very well behaved, very loyal dog getting messed up by phosphorus was like, that's
brutal.
a friend of mine saw that, found a dog with because the Russians, the infamous one is the Z symbol. But they have Z, they have O, and they have V, and I believe it's to do with the directions that they've either come from or come towards. And a friend of mine found a dog that had the letter V burned into it.
Why? Oh my goodness.
Yeah, just because.
Well,
And it's like there's I don't know. For me, once you start, it sounds ridiculous because you are like in the business of killing people. But there's just something crosses a line when it starts to be like dogs. It's like it wasn't posing any threat to you. It's somebody's loyal companion that didn't know any better, and it's yeah.
I don't think I don't want to generalize about Russians, but I imagine there are a lot of people in Wagner or the Russian armed forces that probably just don't care. And the Soviet mindset,
Yeah.
if they're
Yeah.
willing to sacrifice their people like it's nothing to gain a village or an airport or something, I don't think they would care much about dogs.
Yeah, yeah. Again, it's like I can understand that mindset and what's driven it to them. A friend of mine, he was a medic in Bakhmut, and he said the worst thing that they saw was a Ukrainian soldier who was still alive, and he'd been castrated and then hanged out of a window, and they put a sign that said "A gift from Prigozhin" on a sign like round his neck. And that's like Prigozhin is the guy who runs Wagner, and they're like capturing people and castrating them and just leaving them there, and like it's funny to them. So the like, as much as you see like Western media demonizing Russians as all like horribly evil and uniquely evil, ironically enough, it's true when it's not true, because they don't actually they don't tell you what's actually happening in this war. They just go, oh, they're bad because they're invading. It's like the reasoning is not the evil part. It's not just torturing, but like castrating them and then letting them go with a joke, like it's funny. And it's these are apparently people who are their brothers, according to the Russians, because the Russians think that from their point of view, the Ukrainians are given their national identity only by Westerners who are trying to separate them from Russia, and they're actually one people, and they're all brothers, and they're one nation. They should be together, and then they just castrate them and think it's funny. It's like that's not how brothers behave.
Yeah, if they were one people, I don't think there would be much resistance if they had shown up. I mean, it's like ridiculous.
But it's like that's their own propaganda saying that.
Right.
Their own propaganda, their own viewpoint is that Ukrainians and Russians are one people, and yet the Russians are more than happy to commit these atrocities against Ukrainians who are apparently the same as them. It's just something doesn't quite add up there.
Well, maybe it could be. I've heard that a lot of these. A lot of people on the side of the Russian armed forces are not ethnically Russian. There's a lot of like Dagestanis and Chechens, and what do you have to say about that?
I've met a lot of Chechens on both sides. Well, I'd say on both sides. I haven't met any Chechens on the other side, but I have met many Chechens on the Ukrainian side, and I know there are a lot of Chechens on the Russian side. But the Chechens I've met, you can tell they're Chechens. They just have a different attitude and a different, like, even when they're like, red haired and pale, and they look like normal white or normal Eastern European peoples, you can tell that just in their attitude, they're very, very different people. They all think they're invincible, which can be quite funny, because they genuinely think no one can kill them. And that's something from both sides. From what I've seen of both sides, it's Chechens they really hate each other as well. And I obviously I can sympathize with the Chechens on our side, because their home was destroyed by Russians. The Russians invaded and flattened it and leveled it. And then Kadyrov's father, the current guy in charge of Chechnya, Kadyrov, his father fought on the side of the rebels against the Russians and then changed sides at the last minute so that he could seize power. And they've been ruling Chechnya ever since. And usually, if the Chechens are deployed on the Russian side, they'll be behind the Russian lines, because the Russians have always been quite frightened of them. So the idea is that by having Chechens behind the front lines, if anybody breaks and tries to run, the Chechens can shoot them or apprehend them or whatever. And I've heard of some really terrible things the Chechens have been doing.
To fleeing Russians, because they just don't care about Russians, really.
No, yeah, to fleeing Russians and to Ukrainians as well. I heard from several Ukrainians. There was a story. I can't I can't substantiate how true this was, but I was told this by several Ukrainians that the Chechens had taken somewhere and they'd it's like over 100 of them had raped these 3 women and then hanged them.
Wow.
So yeah, they were just they're not people you would want to sit down for a drink with.
I don't know much about Chechens, but these particular ones don't sound like nice people.
No, but Chechens have a reputation of being very violent and very warlike, and I think, in my experience, that's well deserved. Even the Chechens on our side aren't people I would like to necessarily sit and hang around with. That's like, no offense to them, but they have their own thing and they do their own thing, and it's like they're very again they all believe that they're fighting a holy war, so they're not scared of dying, and that's good in a lot of ways. It makes them very brave. It makes them very courageous. But it's not the kind of mentality that you want to be around. Like, obviously, being in a war zone, you understand that, yes, you might die at any moment. Yeah, it's very likely that you're going to die at any moment. But to be one guy amongst a bunch of people and all of them are going, we can't wait to die because we're going to go to paradise.
Yeah, they're very willing to. They're more than willing to throw their life away.
Else.
You don't want to be in a unit with people like that.
Yeah, again, they can. I don't mean any disrespect to them because they're especially the Chechens on our side are fighting for their home, the same way as all the Ukrainians are, except the Chechens have already lost theirs. This would be like if Ukraine lost the war and then Russia invaded Estonia, and
you'd have Ukrainian fighters up there.
Yeah, lots of Ukrainians going into Estonia to help them, and I like. And it is good for morale because the Russians are terrified of them. So when they think they're going to fight some Chechens or some foreign evil Nazi mercenaries, it does make them nervous, which is great.
I want to get back to the Soviet mindset and the equipment of the Russians. I wanted to ask you, because I was asking you if you had come across any Russians or any Russian bodies. Have you come across like Russian equipment? Like, there's stories going around that the Russian soldiers, like, none of them actually have any armor. Like when I say armor, obviously I don't mean their vehicles. I mean like on their body, like
armor,
helmets. It's like cardboard in their plate carrier or something.
Yeah, and like stuff with T-shirts and stuff like that. I've heard about it from other people, and I've seen pictures of it, but it's not something I've come across myself. It's the Russian army is so huge that you can't talk about the Russian army having this equipment. Like some of the guys, like some of the Wagner infiltration units are equipped as well as any modern special forces. But then you have conscripts from the DPR and LPR they've got Mosin Nagants and a tin can helmet. It's such a wide array. There's nothing really that standardized. So you'll have very high ranking. I've seen photos recently of some like Russian, I don't know if they were territorial police or like Rosfadia or whatever you call them. But some of they all had the little AKs, the AK-74U.
It's a short barrel.
Yeah, the AKS-74U, the little one. Yeah, and some of them have like American M4 stocks on them. It just looks crazy. It looks bizarre, but it's a thing. Like, it's almost a sign of wealth and prestige to have. And there's a little bit of that in the Ukrainian army as well. It's like the more money you have, you can afford to kit out your weapon and spray paint it and stuff like that. And it's a status symbol. I quite like that. I know that I'm not supposed to like that because I'm supposed to say that everybody should be being equipped with the same thing. But it almost harkens back to this old heroic ideal of like, because I always had my own equipment and I was wearing all sorts of stuff with completely different to the guy next to me. It's like if you saw somebody dressed like me, you would assume it was me without having to see who it was. And you start to like, be able to identify people by their choice in plate carrier and their choice in where their mag patch are. And it feels like this whole almost heroic ideal of wearing your armor and this your weapon. It's like having a sword with a load of, you know, gilding and intricate designs on it. And it kind of feels a little bit like that. And
It kind of like harkens back to like Indo-European aristocratic individualism.
yeah, and this like, you know, how knights would have their heraldry painted on their shield. And it's like the modern equivalent of that is to wear some stupid brightly colored patch that's completely impractical.
Or to have like a cool spray painted gun,
Yeah, or like, or you've got a really cool foregrip and a really Gucci sight on the back of the weapon, and you've replaced the stock with something really cool, and you've basically just removed everything Soviet about the weapon apart from the internal parts and just replaced it. And like, there's some AK bullpups now, which is just insane. They're making bullpup AKs now. And it is very like individual. It's your weapon and your armor. You don't have like, people have uniforms, but if you're still wearing it, it's like,
you're not cool.
yeah, either you don't care or you don't have any money. So there is this kind of individuality, ironically, that comes from people having their own armor, having their own kit. Like, you'd be amazed having multicam. Having multicam is like, wow, this guy's cool.
It's like their way of like pushing back against the Soviet mindset.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, but I do like this whole, like, as I say, it's an almost heroic, Homeric ideal where you have your armor and your weapon and everyone looks like an individual and you can tell who's who. Because I was the only guy in my unit wearing Flecktarn, which is the German camo. And if people saw Flecktarn jacket, Flecktarn helmet, oh, that's me. And that's kind of cool, I think.
I think
not necessarily
as long as they know it's you, I think it's cool.
Yeah, it's not practical necessarily, but it is like, that's, you know, it's you're not losing the sense of individuality that you have. Because I've got very long hair and I've kept very long hair the whole time that I was out there, and I've never had to shave it or cut it off. And obviously a big reason you have, you know, your head shaved and you wear a uniform is because you're not an individual, you're part of a machine. But there is something kind of appealing about still having that sense of individuality while you're on the front.
I can see how that kind of harkens back to something from the past, and as I said, like Indo-European aristocratic individualism. I imagine our European ancestors or Indo-European ancestors, were had all of their own equipment. I mean, of course they did. There was no manufacturing, and they had their own style.
And they were fighting in that same region as well. So.
Yeah, absolutely. How ironic.
I think it'd be a little bit different if I tried to get a chariot.
Yeah, I don't think that's going to work in a
Although, if you're sat in a trench and you stick your head out and you look and there's a guy riding a chariot towards you, I think that would be a little bit intimidating.
Maybe it would be.
You would think you'd gone mad for a start, but
that would be interesting. So moving forward with the discussion, I guess, where do you think this war is headed? Do you think it can continue as it has been? Do you think the Ukrainians are winning? Do you think the Russians have a lot more to throw at the Ukrainians? Let's get into that.
It's very hard to tell. I think what's most likely going to happen is the Russians are going to make a big offensive. It's going to push the Ukrainians back. And then because the Russians can take objectives, but they're not very good at holding them, after a while, the Ukrainians will have a counteroffensive and they'll take it all back. And it's just, I've compared this war to, if you can imagine two people who can't box having a boxing match. They're just punching each other in the head until one of them falls over. It's not, there's no like dodging or blocking or any like kind of art to it. It's just two people hitting each other in the head until one of them goes down. It's a very attritional war. And that kind of works on the Ukrainian side because they're on the defense. If you're defending in an attritional war, the idea is that you can bleed the enemy dry as they're moving towards you. So it's like the Ukrainians are never going to they're never going to get to Poland. You know what I mean? If they start having to cross the Polish border to be able to be safe from the Russians, then the Poles are going to step in, and then it's going to be an entirely new war with an even better equipped and better prepared army than the Ukrainians were. So I can't tell you how I think this is going to go. I think the most logical solution will be the Russians are looking for a way to say that they've won. Even if they can't win, they will look to have achieved an objective that they can say, this is what our intention all along. We only ever wanted Donetsk, for example. We've taken Donetsk. Okay, we've won. That's what they want. The Russian system it won't work if they just go, yeah, we lost. Because that shatters their own myths about themselves, which are very, very important to them. They are still talking at the minute about the Germans are sending tanks. We'll push on to Berlin. We'll push on to Berlin again. We did it before. We'll do it again. And it's this kind of myth of their own invincibility that keeps them unified, I think.
They're having such a hard time in Ukraine. I mean, short of using nukes, I have a hard time seeing Russia doing anything to any other European country.
Oh, yeah, of course. I think even the Baltics would absolutely kick the shit out of them at this point. But the thing about nukes is the Russians have been quite clever with all of this because they're talking about the use of tactical nukes and they keep threatening the use of tactical nukes. And everyone's going, oh, no, they're going to use tactical nukes. If they do that, it'll cross the line, and they keep threatening it. But they're actually already using thermobaric missiles, which they've been using since the start of the war. And those things are way worse than a tactical nuke. Like a thermobaric, if the blast doesn't kill you, it rips the oxygen out of the air and it will turn your lungs inside out. Those things are absolutely horrible, and they've got a wider blast radius and a wider effective range than a tactical nuke. And obviously you're not causing radiation and fallout damage in the area, which means troops can then move into it afterwards. It's like those things are way worse than a tactical nuclear weapon. But by playing on this kind of fear of everyone has around the word nuclear, they kind of get away with using thermobarics, which is, in my opinion, way worse.
Interesting. I didn't know that. So the war is probably going to continue in Ukraine for a while. Probably.
Oh yeah.
Probably another. What do you think? Another 5 to 10 years of fighting?
Maybe. I think something similar to what happened in 2014 will most likely happen, where both sides kind of run out of steam and just kind of have standoffs and launch a little bit of artillery at each other here and there. But I think we'll see periods. I won't call it peace by any means, but I think there's going to be periods of maybe a couple of months where you're not really seeing any attempts at advancing or counterattacking on either side. I think that's an eventuality because the Russians are going to run out of money, and that's just inevitable because their biggest friend has been China, and the Chinese are getting a little bit embarrassed. They don't really obviously they hate the West and they don't want anything to do with the Americans, but they don't actually like the Russians that much either because they've had border skirmishes
in the past. Yeah,
it's like they're only really keeping the Russians as their friends because they've been useful, and the Russians have kind of proven the fact that they're not, and they're a liability, which means the Chinese don't really have a reason to be such good friends with them, which is why you've not seen them sending all the support. It's like the North Koreans now are talking about sending soldiers to act as military police and police forces and forces of martial law in Russian occupied regions. The Chinese have never offered anything like that.
Yeah, that's interesting because this gets into predictions about World War III, and I think it's okay to make predictions if I mean, it's just a prediction, right? None of us have a crystal ball. We
Yeah.
could be very wrong about all of our predictions, but there's a lot of talk about like World War III and Americans protecting Taiwan from a Chinese invasion and things kicking off that way. But it really does seem like it just seems like Russia is really losing steam, or things are going to continue but kind of cool off a little bit, as you were saying. It'll just turn into kind of like what 2014 kind of turned into, with people just sitting in trenches and just shooting at each other. Russia doesn't have the military wherewithal to invade anywhere else after this, right now, certainly. So I just can't. I kind of have a hard time imagining like how big World War III could possibly be. Because if it does happen, it's just going to be between the U.S. and and CCP China. Really, I don't. I mean, I'm not saying Russia wouldn't be involved, but it would have to be. It's not. It doesn't seem like something that's going to happen anytime soon, considering that Russia is really running out of steam.
It possibly would have been involved a lot more had this war not ground them down so much. And again, people, a lot of Americans, and I can understand the mentality, because there's a financial crisis. People are paying more than ever to heat their homes and drive to work and for food and everything like that. So the US government sending all this money to a foreign country to fight a foreign war, I can understand why Americans are upset by that. But I don't think a lot of people realize just what exactly this is doing, because all of these firearms and military industrial complex manufacturers like Lockheed Martin and Texas Instruments and all these guys, these are American businesses that are employing Americans, and they're employing very, very high level, very educated people who could absolutely just go and get a job somewhere else. If there isn't an industry for these kinds of weapons to be developed, then that industry decays, and it's very difficult to fulfill those roles and those positions. So the Americans now have an excuse to keep these industries going and developing new weapons and developing new tech and producing all this stuff. So that those industries are now like better funded than ever. You've now got an entire logistics system that has been trained in getting military equipment to a far away foreign area. All your logistics guys are now drilled in that. They now know what their problems are, and they're working on solving those. One of the biggest military contributors who would have come to China's aid in a war over Taiwan has now been ground to dust, like effectively, in terms of like their capacity to fight the Americans. Can you imagine Russia trying to take on America now with its current military capacity?
Oh, there's no way. There's no
absolutely no way, and that's been achieved without deploying a single American soldier in a combat role.
It's interesting to think, because before, like, Russia was a big exporter of like arms and tanks and all kinds of military hardware, and now they've been ground down economically. They might not even be able to export anything for a while, I imagine.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it's going to be interesting to see how things play out in the future. If China and Russia, well, Russia's not very clever, I guess, in this context, or I should say the Kremlin. I think Russia and China, they historically they haven't been very good at war, but what they have been good at is espionage, and particularly subverting values, right? Like Yuri Bezmenov talked about this. And I think instead of World War III, what we'll see is that these countries, they'll start to think, okay, well, we can't go toe to toe with the West. Look what happened in Ukraine, but we can throw more money at like Black Lives Matter.
Yeah. And they're calling it fifth generation warfare, aren't they?
Yeah.
This idea of the ideological warfare.
Yes, yeah, and like kind of stirring up like civil unrest and even civil war in Western countries,
Yeah,
and throwing migrants at the West.
yeah. I mean, you very rarely have seen this kind of ideological warfare. I know everybody looks at World War II, and there's this sort of pervading narrative that World War II was about all the freed lovers of democracy fighting against the evil Nazis and fascists and all that sort of thing. But no, it wasn't that at all. It was like a lot of the German infantry, a lot of the German regular army were not ideological at all. They were just fighting for Germany.
Right.
And you had British fascists in Britain fighting against the Germans and Italians. It's like it wasn't an ideological war at all. People in charge had their ideologies, but the nature of it was a country against a country. Whereas now it's the Russians have played this game very, very well, because what kind of narratives are coming out? You have the guys on the right wing are all saying that Ukraine, the war in Ukraine is about stopping global homo. We've got to fight global homo because the Ukrainians are all apparently they all love drag queens and they love nothing more than American propaganda and
gay discos and
yeah, it's like they still don't have
obviously nonsense.
They still don't have gay marriage in Ukraine, and supporting it is still regarded as weird. Like that's the culture over there. And then you have the other side, which is the Russians are fighting imperialism. They're fighting against American imperialism because they're so great and so tolerant, and the Ukrainians are all evil, racist Nazis. And it's like you have people on all sides of the political spectrum buying into this.
You also have actually like people in the dissident right that even if they don't support Russia, they're sort of buying into these memes about like American imperialism and other. I mean, I'm not saying American imperialism isn't an issue, but what Russia has done has like strengthened, has certainly strengthened NATO, and NATO.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I think one of the best takes I've ever seen written about this whole war. I can't remember who it was from. He was saying like, "I'm anti-NATO. That is my biggest belief, which is why I want Russia to be crushed as quickly and as efficiently as possible. Because without them, NATO has no reason to exist."
Right.
And it would just crumble. It's like everyone's saying, "Oh yeah, we support Russia because if they win, it's a blow to NATO." And it's like, no, it isn't. It's the best thing possible for NATO because all of a sudden they have popular support again. People are scared, and you can get scared people to agree to anything. It's like Finland and Sweden would have never joined NATO if not for this invasion, because their people wouldn't have supported it. But all of a sudden, you have these countries going, "Yeah, we want to be part of this," because they're frightened. They're frightened that they're next. It's like the worst thing that could have happened to NATO is you just could have kept continuing as things were. Nobody cared. Nobody really cared about NATO or what it was. It's
right. I don't think all of these U.S. military bases in Europe would have been as just. I mean, I feel I'm under the assumption that they're there because of Russia.
A lot of it, yeah. I mean, there's American military bases in the UK, but it's a little bit different because the UK and the US we wear like basically the same uniform, and we speak the same language, and we have similar cultures, and we're always like deployed doing similar things. So it's not as weird for us to have Americans here. Whereas I can imagine for Germans and Frenchmen and Poles, like it might be a little bit weird to have these people who seem a lot more foreign than they do to us. But equally, it's like you ask the Poles, would you rather have the Americans here or the Russians? Like, what do you think the answer is that going to be? Like the Polish people are 99 out of 100 going to say like, I'd rather have the Americans here because the Americans have the Patriot missiles and Abrams.
Yeah, and they're not going to impose their Soviet ideology or post-Soviet or whatever. They don't. At least the Americans don't have a Soviet mindset. They're going to kind of let the Poles be Poles, but maybe they'll have to contend with a McDonald's. Big deal,
Yeah,
or whatever.
McDonald's, which are already there, and
Yeah,
quite
McDonald's or communism, pick one.
yeah, it's like, but that's a like a big question, is this idea of like, okay, Western capitalist comfort or Soviet style, Russian poverty. It's like you can make all the ideological arguments in the world for like why having like no capitalism and no corporate influence is better than having a McDonald's. But like most civilians are going to go, I want safety and comfort. They're always going to gravitate towards that. You cannot convince the masses that safety and comfort are bad for them. It just won't happen.
Right.
It's why aristocracies are important, because these are where your ideological leaders come from. They're okay, I can see this is going to be harmful for the people, so we're not going to have that. Whereas if you just ask the masses what they want more comfort, they want more entertainment, and they want more safety. It's like, even in the Roman Empire, it was quite famously, it was like, give them bread and circuses. People naturally gravitate towards that. You can't convince the vast majority of the population that they would be better under Russian rule. You can't do it, even in Ukraine, because they've had Russian rule and they're looking at the West going, actually, that doesn't seem so bad after all.
It's certainly the lesser of the evils. Yes. Yeah. Absolutely.
And I've seen as well, going back to the propaganda thing, and ticking every box. I've seen Russian nationalist Telegram channels talking about how they hate it because it's difficult to motivate the men. It's like, it's difficult to tell them what they're fighting for. It's like, so you have these far right Russian nationalists. Like, what are we fighting for? Denazification. We're denazifying a country of nationalists who are, in their eyes, the same as them. It's like, oh, that's not very motivating. It's like, so there's all this. You can tell them, oh, they're trying to fight globo homo, but they're fighting Ukrainian nationalists.
Right.
And they were actually complaining about this because it's like, there's no consistent ideology that they can all rally around to say, this is what we're fighting for.
Well, in Russia, like the Russian Federation, it's basically like just hard civic nationalism, patriotism.
Yeah.
But it's not really. It's certainly not Russian nationalism or actual Russian patriotism. It's just.
I mean, there are actual Russian nationalist groups fighting in Ukraine,
right?
But there are more. I would say more, I wouldn't put money on it, but I've met hardcore Russian nationalists in Ukraine fighting against the Russians.
That's interesting.
Because to them, it's more important that the Kremlin is defeated so that they can have actual Russian nationalism and get along with the Ukrainians. Like, their fight isn't with the Ukrainians. It's not the Ukrainians destroying their state and throwing them in prison and having them tortured to death for being actual nationalists.
Yeah, it's Russian nationalism is banned in the Russian Federation, right?
Yeah.
It's
so a lot of them come to Ukraine to help. It's the same. You saw the same thing with Belarus. Lots of Belarusian nationalists who want rid of Lukashenko come to Ukraine and they fight. And they're some of the hardest fighters. There was a Belarusian guy, he got his leg blown off by a landmine. And like 3 days later, so it's something I don't know if it was 3 days, but it was an absurdly short amount of time later. He had a prosthetic and he was back on the front line.
That's hardcore.
It's like, yeah, it's like that is a motivated soldier.
Mm-hmm. Indeed. Is there anything else you would like to cover? I think that about wraps it up. We're getting pretty close to 2 hours here. We could keep going, but
no, I think in terms of the war and my experiences, I've told a lot. I've told the juicy stuff that I can tell.
yeah, indeed. So yeah, I guess that wraps it up. Thank you so much for coming on here and talking with me about Ukraine. This was absolutely fascinating, and I'd love to
not at all.
talk again.
It's been good fun. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
And yeah, that's pretty much it. Thank you for watching, everyone. And I'll be uploading this to YouTube soon.